And along with that, they were often forced to flee their homes and areas that they live in because of all the violence. Boston and the struggle for equality and educational opportunity. So, as you know, in Massachusetts and the northern states, they were a lot more accepting of enslaved people becoming free. So, there were no exclusion laws in Massachusetts schools in the early 1800s. Blacks were welcome to go into white schools. They could go in whatever school they wanted. However, there was low attendance of the blacks in those schools, which led to poor economic conditions for the blacks and their families. And this was all caused due to prejudice. So even though they were able to choose what school they wanted to go to, there was still a lot of bullying and prejudice of the whites in the schools that they were going to. In 1798, as well as 1800, parents and educated people in the community, African Americans in the community, went to the Boston School Committee, and asked for a separate system of schools. They were denied, so they wanted segregation. They said that it might result in other groups asking for their own separate schools, which was their reasoning. Then eventually in 1806, the Boston School Committee opened segregated schools and finally agreed with public funding and contributions from white philanthropists. So within that couple of years after they've been asking, they did try and have their own schools. However, they didn't last very long, only about 6 months, and they were only privately owned. So in 1812, the Boston School Committee kind of revamped the segregated school legislative, and they made permanent funds and then gained direct control over the segregated African American school. There was still no law requiring the segregation, so they could still choose to go to the all-white schools. However, no one really wanted to do that. The African Americans supported the segregation since they were able to feel comfortable in the school place, and private and public money both supported the school. Now, while they were on the side in supporting segregation of schools, African American parents were angry because they were paying taxes. However, most of those taxes went to support the white schools only. So this is kind of when things began to change. So continuing that slide, in the 1920s, the African Americans realized the inferior education. So in their black schools, they had mediocre teachers, no building upkeep, and they realized that segregated education wasn't benefiting either race. It was separate but equal, is what everyone kept throwing out, but they weren't equal at all. So they had the Massachusetts School Board agree to rebuild the school. Now, with word of Massachusetts going around, David Walker, who was a black abolitionist, came up with a theory that segregated education was a white conspiracy theory to keep blacks in a state of ignorance. So by having them have an inferior education, they won't be able to gain enough knowledge to figure out what the whites are secretly doing behind their backs. He also believed that the African colonization movement to send free blacks back to Africa. So they thought that, okay, if we don't educate them enough, we'll be able to kind of convince them to just move back to Africa. And the blacks no longer had control of the schools or education like they previously did. So since they were getting more money funded toward them, they weren't in control of the schools, and he was highly against that. Then, after several court cases, countless, in 1855 in the northern areas and in Massachusetts, there was a law stating that no child can be denied admission to a public school on the basis of race or religious options. And then in September, whenever school began for the year, there were 0 violent hostilities, only in Massachusetts. Now, moving on to the southern states, the plantation society. Plantation owners lived in fear that slaves would run or revolt. So, to try and prevent those options and be proactive about it, brutality was essential, according to plantation owners. So they would beat and hang. They hanged some of the slaves just to have the others in fear of running or revolting or breaking any of the rules. Linguistic isolation in barracks. What that means is that oftentimes African Americans lived in barracks and kind of old shacks to keep them away from the whites and the plantation owners and the other workers. And not only were they linguistically isolated from the European culture and hearing and seeing the Europeans and the plantation owners, but they were also in isolation within their own barracks with the others African Americans, because there are so many different dialects that none of them really spoke the same language. So not only could they not talk to people of their own culture, they couldn't talk or associate with the new culture or assimilate or anything like that. So with that being said, they created new social interaction from African cultural patterns involving marriage, family relations, child rearing, friendships. So I'm sure that involved a lot of noise making, perhaps actions, and with those actions being seen with each other, they were able to create new words. Then, the economic value of slave production went up, so slaves were mating with plantation owners, white plantation owners, to try and get more workers around the farm. And then these would be American born, however, they were still considered slaves at this time. So this new generation of slaves had more access to English words since they were kind of half European. They still weren't as accepted, but they were able to be more inclined to see and be around that type of culture. And they also came up with their own gestures and partial languages. And they were given English names right when they were born. Another difference within the Southern society versus the North, which we've talked about already, is that the stealing of a master's food was not considered stealing for the slaves, due to the fact that the slaves were owned by the masters, and so was the food. They were stealing the food, and it was going straight back to themselves. So the slaves owned the food, the plantation owners owned the food, and the plantation owners owned the slaves, and so it wasn't a wrongdoing. However, on the contrary, stealing another slave's items was being just as cruel as a white man in the slave's eyes. Also, the slave owners had so much power that they could basically cause they would decide the life or the death of a person, and they could just completely break up families to get what they wanted and sell their children. Learning to read. So, as I talked about before, literacy was a punishable crime for Southern enslaved Africans. They were not allowed to read at all. They weren't allowed to have books. It was easier for those in cities in the southern areas. There was a greater chance to earn money to purchase freedom. So they would be able to kind of assimilate more with the culture in there and gain money and read books. It was more acceptable there. Plantation slaves, however, used the Civil War and newspapers to help them read in secret. Citizenship for African Americans. The Naturalization Act of 1790 said that African immigrants were denied the right to become U.S. citizens. So, this led to the chain of denial and the loophole after loophole of reasons on why blacks could not be citizens, all said and justified by Chief Justice Roger Taney. He said that the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were not intended to protect the rights of blacks. that citizenship could only be achieved through naturalization, birth on U.S. soil, or birth to an American father. However, this excluded native birth or birth to an American father, only included those born completely white. And then even if they were native born, they did not qualify. However, they still owed allegiance to state and federal government. So like I talked about before, people were becoming upset about having to pay taxes but not having any equal rights. So then eventually in 1866, all persons native born were citizens. So those who were born half black or African American slaves, and then half slave owners, so they were half white, half black. They now were citizens because they were born in the country. And then in 1870, the citizenship to aliens of African nativity and descent were finally considered. The Great Literacy Crusade. So in 1863, only about 7% of African American population was literate. So then we have two other guys that we need to talk about. Booker T. Washington was in favor of segregated industrial education. He was an African American freed slave. He thought it gave blacks a role, as something to look forward to, and would end ostracization, which means feeling excluded, basically. Newly graduated teachers to teach morality and work habits were sent down into the South to give occupational training. He believed that classical studies only promoted vanity and some arrogance, basically. And this all involved the South. They were growing their crops and they needed more workers. And Booker T. Washington saw this as an opportunity for newly released slaves to go and work. Southerners opposed the idea of higher education with the chance that workers would demand higher wages. Then on the opposing hand, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also a freed slave, wanted future leaders, and he was the one who founded NAACP. He believed that by educating themselves, they would give blacks a promising and hopeful future. Resisting segregation. So this is all the ideals of Du Bois. He wanted an education that would breed leaders to protect the social and political rights of the black community and promote awareness of inevitable struggle. So he knew they were going to struggle. That's inevitable, but he wanted to promote it and for them to understand you're going to struggle regardless, so might as well learn while you're struggling. He also wanted to educate blacks not to be happy, but rather unhappy with their lives and current situations and understand that they're going to make a difference anyway. Now what Du Bois is saying exactly is that Washington is promoting the act of giving in to the white men just so life will be easier for the newly released slaves without the prejudice. However, what Washington doesn't understand that Du Bois does is that the lack of discrimination is only temporary. And you can realize that when the taxes start to grow, there's an increase in taxes that the slaves have to pay, and they're getting paid little to nothing, and they don't have the education, and they can't revolt, and that's exactly what Du Bois feared. And I also liked this quote from the book on page 66, which says, "Integrated schools meant equal funding and facilities, but also raised the possibility that white teachers might not be dedicated to ensuring the success of their black students." So once desegregation was happening, it was still kind of a tricky situation because even though they're in a well-funded school, you know, you're not necessarily going to get the right type of education by their teachers who are predominantly white. And finally, after playing the game of Kahoot, which I sent the link to in an email, go ahead and use these discussion questions to continue on with the class. And that is your so-called homework. You don't have to turn anything in or anything, but just go ahead and discuss it. Okay, thanks guys.